Okay, great. Recording has started. Everybody, again, welcome today. I'd like to thank you for being here. And I would like to turn it now over to Dr. Neil Nance-Carroll, who will be hosting and facilitating today's session. If you have questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat. Of course, you can also, interrupt it, whatever you feel is appropriate to assist you. Thank you so much. Neil?
All right. So hi, I'm Dr. Neil Nance-Carroll. I'm going to be focusing on incorporating diversity objectives into a couple of our assignments. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about how to incorporate diversity objectives across a variety of assignments throughout the course so that it isn't sort of set up in a single diversity week eventually. Before I get into that, I'm going to talk about a couple big picture parts of this. So I'm going to start with the obvious one. And that's why we're incorporating them in the first place. And that's that there's a moral imperative in higher education to make our materials more diverse. This helps us better serve all of our students. However, I'm also aware that discussing diversity can make people uncomfortable. In particular, discussions of race are often seen as fraught, and that people may be reluctant to have these discussions in the classroom. The recent news stories about critical race theory in several states, obviously, primarily driven by people who have no idea what critical race theory is, those often heighten people's concerns. And so while some approaches to talking about racism focus on personal transformation, such as unconscious bias training, for example, those are aimed at people who are willing to learn and have a desire to change their own behavior. That describes some of our students, but it doesn't describe all of our students. So I'm going to be looking at how we're reaching reluctant students in particular. So some students struggle with diversity as an objective. And this could be students who are clueless, who are misinformed, who are afraid, or who are hostile. And these categories are not mutually exclusive, nor are they exhaustive. But they do highlight that students are coming in with differing attitudes and levels of knowledge. Adjusting to levels of knowledge is relatively easy in comparison to adjusting to the differing attitudes that you're going to find in a single classroom. How do you teach someone about diversity when they react negatively to the word itself? So for students who are clueless, diversity is relatively easy. They know they're here to learn, we're here to teach. So they benefit greatly from direct instruction about current and historical issues. And the last part of what I'm going to talk about today is going to go into that direct instruction about diversity. When we're talking about students who are misinformed, they often believe that racism is a problem in the past. These students not only need that direct instruction, but they need a structure for unlearning false information. Ideally, that false information needs to be presented as separate from them, rather than asking them to say what they know and then telling them that they're wrong. Situations like that can often feel like a trap to them and can cause them to double down on negative ideologies or to become afraid. So people who are afraid are also misinformed often, but they've often internalized a false narrative of cancel culture. And they believe that people are routinely ostracized or punished for what they see as little mistakes. These students benefit from assurances and emphasis that they're being provided with the information that's going to save them from those problems later on, and the emphasis that they're held in positive regard, that no one is here to trap them and that people think well of them. The last group, obviously the hardest group, students who are hostile. Whether or not they would describe themselves as racist, they hold racist viewpoints and they're bolstered by a narrative of the culture wars. These students benefit from an emphasis on assignments as part of normal coursework, not as a form of personal transformation. In dealing with these students, it's also often helpful to minimize the role of personal opinions in class discussion so that they don't have the opportunity to disrupt learning and to avoid a sort of showdown that some hostile students are attempting to provoke. So anticipating these concerns can make it a lot easier to go through the assignments, can reduce negative responses, or what I'm going to describe throughout this as pushback from those students. Having more assignments focused on diversity also helps normalize this, rather than as a single assignment or a short-term goal, which might cause some students to simply skip those weeks or shut down for those weeks. If it's built in from the start, the assignments will fit more easily into it. So, responding to reluctant students. So some of the common objectives that they have are pretty familiar. An insistence they already know a lot about something, perceived fear they're going to be shamed, a claim from white students that they've been victims of racism, or what was at one point called reverse racism, or anger at being forced to do this work in school. And so I'm going to talk briefly about how I typically respond to those and how I know other people have responded to them productively in the past. So for that first one, when students say, oh, I already know about this, they often mean we covered the Civil War and civil rights in high school, so I'm done. That's all of racism. Often it's best not to push back against their claim of knowing, but rather to push towards you have to show that you know. So I'd say something along the lines of, oh, it's great to hear you already know so much about this. As you know, not all students do. So these assignments will probably be pretty easy for you, but make sure you pull from the assigned texts, because I can only grade what you write and demonstrate, not what you know. And that gives them the credit that they're seeking. They want to be validated as already being knowledgeable, but also emphasizes this is an assignment, there will be grades. This is not just about proving that you're a good person, because that's not the goal of this. This isn't merely demonstration, this is actual work as well. For the second one, that perceived fear of being shamed, I have previously offered to let students submit answers privately if they were worried that they were going to mess something up. And typically, that's a student with a lot of anxiety about this, but not necessarily hostility. They really believe that cancel culture is out to get them. So I also want to make sure that I'm not validating that belief, because that belief is false and is not going to serve them well. So I emphasize, as long as you are reading what you're supposed to for this class, you're going to be able to do these assignments in a way that won't be exposing you to embarrassment or what they're perceiving as a sort of social danger there. For the third one, I try and avoid actually taking that one head on when they submit it in private, which might sound weird, considering obviously that is a false belief they hold. As a white person, they haven't been a victim of racism. If they say it publicly, you've got to push back against it because it's a false definition of racism. They need to know that. But for the students saying it privately, this is often their first step to being able to empathize with people who are actually victims of racism. For them, saying, I've experienced the same thing is their version of empathy. And while it might not be what I would love to see as an instructor all the time, it is going to be something that's going to get them along the road to a more productive form of empathy, where they realize injustices and are in a position they might remediate some of them. Now, for the last one, I want to point out, when I was most recently teaching this, I'm talking about in the online space rather than in the physical one. So if we're talking about anger that's occurring in the classroom, obviously our first concern is going to be threat assessment and the safety of our students, whether this anger is turning towards violence. But as long as there doesn't seem to be a violent subtext to their anger, they just feel attacked at having to learn about racism, I often find ignoring the subtext is a productive thing to do there, rather than say, your anger is clearly rooted in your own racism, which isn't going to get either me or that student anywhere. Instead, treat the anger as if this is a surprising result of a normal assignment. So expressing surprise they reacted so strongly, present this as perhaps it was a miscommunication in what they're supposed to do for the assignment. Often, a slight apology for some trivial issue of wording in the assignment. When I said what you learned about this, I wasn't implying you didn't already know about this. I'm just asking you about the content of the thing. Giving them an out, because often after that first expression of anger, the student is actually reasonably willing to learn as long as they haven't been met with hostility in response. They've perceived the opportunity to learn about racism as an attack on themselves. When they are not attacked, they're often surprised and willing to be like, I guess I can keep reading a report. That's probably not that scary. So these are some of the most useful tools for that. A calm demeanor, a consistent focus on the assignments and the readings, rather than trying to tell the student how they should feel. So some of the approaches to responding. As I talked about, positive regard for the student, really useful. Connecting the assignments to their specific academic goals can be useful, and that's something I'm going to get to in just a moment. If they disclose worries, empathizing, but not validating those worries in such a way that would heighten them in the future. And then, when possible, These assignments are focused on business as usual. That reduces the pushback that they might feel if this is presented as an assignment that's going to teach them to be a better person. Because then they are thinking, I'm already a good person, or I don't want to be that kind of person. If we're just presenting these as normal assignments, they can feel much more comfortable. So, building diversity into these other assignments. So, the first two assignments that I'm going to talk about today, I want to point out these are not substitutions for direct instruction about this. These are support for that, and I'll get to how they function as support in a moment. But they still mean that we need to be talking about racism, sexism, homophobia, religious intolerance, ableism, and other forms of prejudice in the classroom. But I'm going to start with assignments that are building a groundwork for that. So the first one is diversity and your major. So as you're probably familiar with, if you're looking at UNIV, we've got chapter 5, that's academic and career development in college. Chapter 6, diversity and global citizenship. So they will be moving from career development into looking at diversity. And this assignment is designed to take them directly there. So for diversity and your major, this gives them an explanation of what they need to do. Depending on your major, you might already know about this. If not, you're going to click on these links and learn about it. Now you're expected to click on the link even if you're already familiar with it, because they have to answer some questions about it. Now, this is not an exhaustive list of majors, and I've been expanding this assignment ever since I taught it. The first one, initially, I just had enough links that it hit all of the colleges. I've been expanding it so that each of these is going to address specific majors or specific fields within it. Ideally, this will eventually reach a large list. But the important thing is each of these resources is a particularly strong article within that. So let me pull out of this and bring up a couple of those articles. So for example, if they're a criminal justice major, this is what the link takes them to. It's an EEOC document. It's 2016, specifically about equal employment for Justice Department. Now, if you're seeing the scroll bar on the far right, you're going to see that this is a very long document. My expectation is not that the students are going to make it through the entire document. That's mentioned on the assignment here. Some of these links lead to very long articles. However, it does have, and I would expect them to read and tell them this in the classroom, an executive summary. And so that's breaking down what issues of diversity in law enforcement this particular article is looking at. It guides them through why diversity in law enforcement matters, what's being done to advance it, what some of the barriers are, and then they're looking at a couple of the different practices, specifically departments that have had success in doing so. Similarly, we go to the nursing one. This is the American Association of Colleges of Nursing, Enhancing Diversity in the Workforce. This is a shorter article, but it contains links to the much longer ones, including the 2004 report that several of the nursing majors reported already having some familiarity with, missing persons, minorities in the health profession. So each of these provides, as you can see, statistical information about this, as well as the practices specific to the profession. I'm going to look at two more real quick. This one for accounting majors. So fostering diversity and inclusion in the accounting workplace. As you can see, we get some sources, we break down what are the benefits of diversity, providing the exhibits for each one of these, the challenges. So last one from CompTIA, this is for the information technology majors. Down, what are the key points? What's going on, diversity discussion, the gender pay gap, that diverse workforces spur innovation, which is an important observation for them. And then hiring the most qualified candidate carries weight for this. So as explaining here, the goal of this assignment is for two parts. Help students understand how the issues of diversity are most relevant to their field. And then as they're seeing themselves as professionals in that field, what they can do about them. We know that virtually all fields fall short in their diversity goals, but seeing those goals presented by their own field can be more powerful than seeing them presented by me or by any other instructor. So it's a well-known assumption that universities are sites of liberal indoctrination. And while that assumption is false, it still carries a lot of weight for some people. And so seeing this coming from their own professional organizations, rather than from what they perceive as a liberal faculty, can be pretty useful for students who are not necessarily directly hostile, but kind of suspicious of the motives of university professors. So this helps students build that connection between their major and diversity goals. And so that can help the students who are potentially hostile, but that can also help the students who are worried that maybe their major isn't going to accept them. This is going to let them see that their professional organizations are welcoming them in. So this isn't just designed to reach white students who might be hostile to diversity. This is also designed for students who are thinking, I don't see a lot of people who look like me in my major. Does that mean that that's going to be a problem for me in the field? And so this can also push them towards some of the targeted groups, scholarships, and opportunities if they start looking at diversity in here. Such as, for example, if they start looking at diversity and accounting, they're going to quickly come across the National Association of Black Accountants, the National Association of Black CPAs. So this can build in some of that support, that sense that diversity isn't something that's just an interest of universities, but something that's going to follow them into the workplace. So now I'm going to shift. It's a big jump to note-taking, but again, this is an assignment that's going to bring in a significant diversity component while also hitting another course objective. So now we're talking about chapter 12 of the textbook, where we're looking at note-taking and some of the study skills here. Now, in that chapter, we have direct explanations of how to complete each of these types of note-taking. So even if the students aren't coming in familiar with an outline format, mapping format, or Cornell format, they are going to know those by the time they've read the chapter. So very easy for them to follow along. And the idea is they're going to practice each of these note-taking styles, see how it works for them, and develop stronger note-taking skills. Now, direct instruction in note-taking is really valuable for some of the students because they may never have thought about how they're supposed to take notes. They just know they're supposed to. And some of them try and type every word the professor says, or they imagine what an outline should look like, but not realizing that they're not learning in something that's already been structured like an outline. If they don't have a study guide, they're not able to get all the details. So the note-taking part is valuable. But as stated, there's nothing on here about diversity. So when I'm teaching note-taking, I let them pull from videos for this. Now, the idea is most of these are not structured to reward easy note-taking. Because taking notes off of a PowerPoint that tells you, hey, this is point 1, this is point 2, this is point 3 is relatively easy. But what we're trying to prepare them for, obviously, are situations in which they're getting this from a complex lecture or from another source that doesn't tell them what the main points are. They have to identify it themselves. So I tell them that in advance. I tell them these are going to be difficult notes. You want to pay very close attention. But then I pick videos that are going to enhance their understanding of a particular issue. And the one that I aimed for here was Native American, well, contemporary discrimination against Native Americans, specifically as it relates to major legal cases. So any videos could have been chosen for this. And this is a particular interest of mine for this, but I think you can build in any diversity component for this assignment that you want, depending on your video selection. So that first one, that BBC pop-up one, this is building their sense of specifically young people. And so since most of our students are of traditional college age, this is a sort of age cohort, but it's also an important reminder of Native Americans as part of the present and the future, rather than as part of the past, which is one of the most pernicious and damaging myths. If we look at the PBS NewsHour segment on the Sioux refusing $1.3 billion, which was intended as payment for the Black Hills, which was not for sale, of course, that sets up some understanding of land ownership and treaty obligations, which remain some of the major legal cases. This also gives a sense of scale, because there's a discussion of why $1.3 billion in the context of remuneration for a huge amount of land is actually somewhat trivial, that when broken down by all of the individuals affected by it, this is not enough money to change their lives. We go to that third one, Russell Means, some very important Native American activist. His testimony in front of the Senate, it's a particularly interesting one for the students to look at, because often when they think about minority rights, they think about it as government intervention is what is being argued for, but Means is arguing for non-intervention. He's saying the regulation of Native Americans by the government is the issue. So for students who have a kind of anti-government or anti-regulation ideology, this is a great moment for them to see that that doesn't put them automatically on the opposite side of people who want racial justice. The PBS NewsHour segment, that's on the Dakota Access Pipeline. Obviously, this is a contemporary issue. Many of the students have heard about the pipeline protests, but many of them we're starting off somewhat misinformed because depending on which news space you're looking at, you're getting a very different story. PBS is, of course, very neutral in their reporting. They're studious about that, but obviously we're seeing a particular perspective on this. Even reporting on it is a form of activism. Now, there's 5 videos listed on here, and they're only required to use 4. Now, the reason is sometimes I use that 5th video, the TED Talk, if the students have generally responded positively towards TED Talks. Some people like them, some don't. And that one also covers the Dakota Access Pipeline. So that one substitutes sometimes for PBS NewsHour 1. Now, that one provides an individual talking rather than a series of interviews, which especially if the students have kind of struggled with keeping track of all the names and dates when they're taking notes, that can be an easier one for them. I've occasionally used that for bridge classes, conditional admits, because they've struggled sometimes with just writing that fast if they haven't had that much experience. So, and her story, of course, quite compelling because she's talking about being a product of genocide and genocide survival. So something that's both tragic, but also hopeful. The idea that she did survive, of course, that this was not a successful genocide, that Native Americans still exist. So in choosing a variety of videos about Native Americans and focusing on hearing Native Americans explain situations and issues that their communities are facing, the students are getting valuable knowledge. They're getting valuable perspective as well. But this is presented as a note-taking assignment. There was no pushback on this focus against an oppressed minority group. And few students even had a basic understanding of these issues. So this felt less like a sort of hot button issue. And all of these were mainstream sources. So when I've used this in the past, I've had no pushback from students whatsoever, which has been quite nice since often discussions of racism lead to immediate pushback from a small number, but a very vocal group of students. And so these prime students to then tackle more direct diversity content. And so the next part that we're going to look at are some materials from the Equal Justice Initiative and the ways that I've used those in my classes. So direct instruction remains essential, and the Equal Justice Initiative materials are both good and, of course, relevant specifically here. We have the EJI right downtown. The students can see this connection to Montgomery in particular. So I'm going to use examples from the online course that I did in spring, in part because this shows how the materials stand on their own, rather than when you're in the classroom to kind of give context and back them up. But obviously, this is easily adaptable to the in-person classroom. I've also done these same materials in person in fall of last year. So this is the context that's provided. I know this is a ton of text to be on a PowerPoint slide. I just wanted to provide this as it appears. And all of these assignments are in the Blackboard for UNIV instructors. So they've already been provided there. So this explains generally what they're going to be doing. So for the next 2 weeks, they're going to look at issues of racial justice in the United States. This gives some context, a reminder that we're looking at this because we have these resources in Montgomery, because these are events that happened in Montgomery, giving them a sense of why we would look at this right here. There's also a focus here in terms of what they're going to read about. I have them read the EJI report on lynching specifically. And that was a choice. They have a variety of reports. I'll take us to the site in just a moment. But the students often already feel like they have a handle on civil rights or on the Civil War. Even if they don't, they feel like they do. Whereas lynching is often a topic that's not going to be covered heavily in high school. This is going to be new information at home. You can also see this kind of reference to what the EJI does. So this kind of anticipates and rejects that sense of, oh, this is about stuff from a long time ago, but rather that sense of building connections to contemporary issues. So here's the first assignment that they're given. So the phrasing here is intentional. It aligns with the reading. So the use of racial terrorism as the description here, that's the language the EJI uses for this. And there's a clear division here between white supremacists and people who wanted justice. That's designed so that students know which side they're supposed to be on. There's not much attraction then to picking a side of bigotry and evil. It's convenient because setting things up so that students can pick either side of something invites some students to pick the racist side of it. And again, that focus on lynching is effective here. Now, it was written to ask them about the reading itself and then making connections to the present day. This allows them to provide either of the two dominant narratives that you might use here. So the first dominant narrative, that is the story of things getting better, right? So students who generally feel like there's been racial progress in the country can say, people used to be lynched, we've seen civil rights occurred, we've seen a greater acceptance in society, and now things are getting better. There's also space for those connections instead to connect lynching directly to contemporary violence against Black people. And while obviously I think that's the stronger one, I also think that's the one that many students are more uncomfortable with. So providing them with both options there lets the assignment work for more students, and again, reduces the potential for pushback. Now, as you can see, everyone reads the lynching report, and then they pick one of those three they want to read about. Now, Slavery in America, Reconstruction in America, and Targeting Black Veterans are all good reports. EJI only produces great ones. I've found the one that many of the students are most attracted to is the Targeting Black Veterans. And I think that's also one that students who were initially somewhat skeptical of studying racism, many students, especially many of our students, have a connection to the military and seeing the ways in which specifically Black veterans were mistreated and many of them were lynched when they returned home is a great sense of betrayal. It's a sense of who's on the correct side of history there. And for students who might not have otherwise initially empathized with victims of lynching, when they see this happening to people in uniform, that empathy is really activated there. So let me just jump out briefly to the EJI site. You can see the reports. So as you can see, there we go. The reports are pretty detailed, pretty long here. But what I want to skip down to, and this leads to one of the last parts I do, I talk to them about why these reports are credible. And as we're looking at down here, it's the references section. So we're also getting into some of the information literacy. It's one of the objectives that we also have for UNIV. So because they can see, oh, this one has all these references, this one has the specificity, the detail, the case studies. And that helps balance them so that they're not as inclined to compare legitimate sources like this with illegitimate or bigoted sources, which are typically lacking in such references, and they can identify the difference between them. So the next one, after they've done the legacies of racial terrorism, for week 2, they do legacies of injustice. And so if they didn't make those connections to present day that first week, then they have a chance that it's reinforced. Now they're going to look at ones that are more contemporary, since much of the EJI work isn't just about the past, but about bringing this to the present. So criminal justice reform or community remembrance projects of victims of lynching, they can see those connections. And this is presented as a short essay. One of the reasons that I use the short essay format for this is that it is a very normal assignment. Rather than having them answer a specific list of questions, some of which they might be uncomfortable with the answer for, they know about writing essays. They know that that's a normal assignment. They know that my background, at least for this, is in English. And so this is about practicing their college level writing skills as well. The more different objectives that it seems to be hitting, the more that students who might shut down when asked to write about racism are going to be like, oh no, I can write. Like, I don't want to be presenting myself as someone who can't do colorful writing. So this one has a discussion. Now, again, because this was an asynchronous online course, this is for a discussion post. But what I want to draw attention to isn't how this particular discussion works. It's that there wasn't a discussion for the first assignment. That was intentional. The first one, they only submitted those answers to me. So any students whose answers were, well, racist, had the opportunity to get feedback on those from somebody who wasn't about to get in an argument with them, but instead just be like, hey, this is a mistake. This is incorrect. They didn't put themselves out publicly with views that they might later want to distance themselves from. They have that opportunity for growth, even within those weeks. Once they've said something publicly, many students won't back down, even if they're starting to realize that what they said was wrong. And so giving them that opportunity to make a mistake in private, and I'm always candid with them if something is wrong, but I'm also pretty open, well-meaning. I assumed that it was a mistake on their part, not that they're a bad person. And so being able to push back to them with that, with the sense of like, oh, I don't think you believe that. That seems weird. And then they're like, oh no, that's not, I'm a good person. I don't believe that. You're like, oh, that's good. That's good. Just make sure you bring that to next week. That gives them the opportunity to not feel like, oh no, I'm now caught out for being a bad person. So this one also sets up the terms for the discussion, which is very much about the assigned text. I'm not asking them to say, what ways have you perpetrated racism within your own life, right? Because many of the times that people are asked to do that kind of personal growth work, that's very scary to do in public. And it's really scary to do in public with a bunch of strangers who you're going to see for the next 4 years. So I'm reluctant to push them on that. Nobody wants to call themselves guilty in that classroom. And so this puts it about what is going on in society. What do these historical texts tell us? So these assignments were presented in weeks 8 and 9 of the semester. By that point, there's a level of trust with the students. I think presenting the EJI materials at the start of the course would have been much less effective under those circumstances, since they would have been a little worried. They'd already received plenty of things back from me. They knew that I wasn't going to bite their head off. The parameters are clearly defined. That limits the opportunities for students who might say something terrible or racist to just do so, and presents those outside the bounds of the assignment itself. As I mentioned about the discussion board, you want to limit the opportunities when the students could say something bad publicly. Give yourself an opportunity to put them on the right track before they do that. Also, in terms of the not saying it publicly, that isn't just for the protection of the potentially racist student. An obvious answer might be like, well, if they're going to say something racist, let them say something racist and then catch them for it. That's not just bad for them, that's also bad for the other students. Because you don't want students to be exposed to bigoted comments that are going to make them feel frightened or unwelcome here. To my knowledge, AUM's been really successful in not having big scandals of racism, which was more than we can say for plenty of universities. So I think opportunities we can have to reinforce that, to say, hey, that's not the kind of place AUM is. This is a place that does value diversity. It's a place that values treating people well. Make sure that the students are experiencing that in their first year. So always make sure to frame this assignment within the norms of these assignments, rather than present this as a radically different one or about personal transformation. But also, for many students, framing something about hope can be really useful. So for example, the one on Reconstruction, many of the students were really excited when they learned about Black congressmen right after the Civil War. That was about not this hidden shame of finding out, oh my God, our country lynched so many people, which is a terrible thing to learn about. But instead, when people were being murdered around them, these people didn't hide, they ran for office. Even when they were having to flee, personally flee being murdered, they were still campaigning. I mean, that's a story of hope. That's a story of bravery. And that's something that several of the students really enjoyed. So just to kind of close this out. So some of the students might not be convinced about the moral imperative of work towards justice, but they can still be motivated by other factors. It doesn't mean that we would give up on that. So the desire to express in-group approved ideas. So if they see professional organizations say that, they can be like, oh, accounting values diversity. Well, I want to be an accountant, so I value diversity. The desire to appear reasonable or within the bounds of normally defined parameters of classroom discussion. So if we've already said this is the range of acceptable things to talk about for a classroom discussion, that's less of an opportunity for the student to be like, you know, I was reading this thing on InfoWars, because that's the sort of thing you want to avoid. And then the desire to maximize personal effectiveness as part of a team or pursuit of career goals. So one of the things that I talk about when we talk about diversity in the classroom is that we have studies in a variety of fields that diverse teams are more effective. They're more creative, they're more successful, they're more innovative. We have the stats on that. And so talking to the students about that, it says this isn't just about some high-minded ideal, although that should be good enough reason, it's not always. If this makes them act or speak in ways that are consistent with the inclusive values of our institution, those are successful interactions. even if we can't quite get their motivation to where we want it to be. So for the rest of the time, I just wanted to ask how else people are interested in incorporating diversity into other assignments. If people have questions, other ideas, love to talk about it. Thank you so much.
I have a question. Does the diversity criteria within UNIV, does it, I know I get that it predominantly focuses on race and ethnicity. Does it also incorporate gender identity, gender, sexuality, other things like that?
Those are discussed, certainly. The way that I've approached it has been primarily through the lens of racial justice. However, I think one of the limitations when we were putting together all of this is that we did not have time to prepare a chapter that addresses all parts of that. I know that's one of the things that we're currently working on.
Gotcha.
So for example, especially as relates to sexual identity, for example, I often talk about that as it relates to professional writing and politeness cues there. Again, trying to connect back a minor thing to an issue of justice. So how you address people, use of pronouns, things like that.
Gotcha. Okay.
To address Dr. Lejeune, did I say it right?
Just Kristen, but yeah.
Kristen. To address that, part of it's on me. I need to add some more to the chapter, and Lynn was very good at pointing out some stuff that was missing. But it is, you know, and it is in the chapter. It is there. It is mentioned. I'm not sure if you're aware of that, but it is there. Okay. And can we expand this section? Sure, absolutely. Some edits need to be made in other areas. I think in each one of our chapters, we can of course put some edits there. But part of that's on me to expand that chapter. But at the same, two things that we cannot forget. I'm sorry, Neil. I'm sorry.
Oh, no.
And let me speak to you directly, Kristen.
Sure.
Two things that we cannot forget. We cannot forget the intersectionality, which I think is what you're hitting at.
Yes.
That is extremely important. And so to discuss this in our classroom, I think we all do to some degree, is vital. But at the same time, are we ignorant? and are we ignorant enough to say that, you know, we're in Montgomery, the site
Sure.
of where are we in the context of where are we? What is happening on a city streets and what is not happening? I'm not concerned with Black Lives Matter. No, I'm not concerned with that. I'm concerned with Black women being, you know, prenatal care. Sure. And I'm concerned with environmental racism. I'm concerned with Black men being locked up, and Black and indigenous men being locked up to a higher degree than people that look like you. And so finding that balance is important. And it's never going to be equal. I'm not here for everyone. I'm here for equity. Sure. But so I'm not telling you how to run it. I'm just, you know, giving you responding to your thing. It's a lot easier when it's someone that looks like you than someone that looks like me that walks up in the classroom and says something. But to answer your question directly, a lot of times we don't want to give the impression, because we need more gender discussion here, I believe, on this campus, more pronoun discussion, and you know, and like I said, this speaks to stuff that the chapter alludes to or directly addresses. But at the same time, we often, I'll just say this, a lot of times, and I've had really great students regardless of race here. But if you, with some, you know, questionable, we all have some questionable students say, hey, that's racist. We get in the idea of the threat of what I call the threat of multiculturalism, and the direction you're going in. I'm not saying you intend it, direction it's often taken, and it often goes in the direction that I think is violent towards, is actually an anti-Black discussion. Because in these discussions on gender and race, who is pushed to the background? What transgender bodies are pushed to the background? Black folks. In the talk of race and culture, who's pushed to the back? It's a pigmentocracy or a false democracy, Kristen. And so in these discussions, everything becomes relative, and we need to all all races, all cultures, we need to sit here together and have this discussion together when there's degrees to this thing. And so finding avenues to talk about that, I think you bring up a great point. But to encourage our students to have a more complex discussion and saying, hey, listen, this country is built off of two groups, essentially two groups, and not that they're the monolith, native blood, Black bondage, period.
I hear you. I
All
got
right.
it. Thank you. That makes sense. I hear you.
I did want to address one other thing, and that's in the diversity and my major, or diversity in your major assignment. That one isn't focused exclusively or depending on which particular major they're in, primarily even on racial diversity. In some of those, for example, much of it is focused on pay equity, on especially if we're looking at some of the technical fields, on discrimination against women. And so in class discussion, that's often something that we can get into. However, I agree, more expansion on that is needed.
I have a
My
question.
next week, Kristen, will speak to some of, it will cover some race stuff, but it will speak to some of what you're talking about as well. Some of your concerns. Yes, that
I
makes sense.
just want to make sure that everybody knows I was not saying there are concerns about it one way or the other. I just
Oh, no,
wanted
no,
to
no,
know if it
no,
was
no.
something-
I don't think you're evil. No, no, no.
Okay.
Oh, by the way, this is the way that I speak. But it's not you, not you. But
Thank
to
you.
speak to some of your, speaks to some, someone's concerns. All right.
Right?
I have a
Go
quick
ahead, Jessica.
question. Hey, yeah, I have a quick question. Last time that I taught, my entire class was POC. And how do you teach as a white person? How would I teach the diversity concept to those who are living it every day, who are living the issues of racism, systemic issues, the outright prejudice issues every day, especially as someone who has a lot of privilege in that area?
Sure, I can speak to that with experience. That's also
Okay,
been
great.
obviously my experience in the classroom. As a white guy, I've got basically every privilege that could be given, especially as a highly educated, reasonably able-bodied one. So there's a certain amount of just being forthright about that. I think there's a fear sometimes to acknowledge that in the classroom, like a desire to talk around it. And the students, they can see that I'm white. And that doesn't make them uncomfortable in my experience. The things that—
Yeah, me too. I didn't realize that they didn't, when we broke down that barrier and I acknowledged the obvious, they're like, well, yeah, but go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, so the big thing that I found that was useful for that is not to just aim for a sort of free form discussion of this, because then it seems like I'm just waiting for them to teach me, which honestly isn't their job. They showed up as students.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean there isn't space for them to talk. I want to be very clear here. But there is sometimes a sense of just like handing it off to them, like, oh, well, you know diversity, tell me. And they're like, well, I don't have to tell you.
Exactly. I want to avoid that.
And so in those cases, I just make sure I've always done my homework on it. So that's, for example, when I'm using the EJI materials, I make sure that I've read it really carefully, go into here's specific facts, details, statistics that I can use to kind of supplement and go off of their points. So if a student is talking about a particular form of structural racism they've experienced, being able to say, yes, definitely, that's one of the issues that this article talks about.
Oh, that's
So
good. That's, yeah.
The big thing that I always want to make sure is that I don't, and I realize I just kind of like cut you off there, that I don't cut them off.
No. It's Zoom. It's easy to do.
But not cutting them off so that there isn't an experience of like, now I'm going to teach you the real thing on that. So a certain validation of lived experience, but a supplementing of that, of saying, I prepped for this. I am, at least within the bounds of this particular conversation, a relevant expert to speak.
Okay, so continue on, just, present it as, as it is, as I prepare more, because obviously I do want to cover this in many areas. But I was just thinking last time that it was, what about those in there? They're like, well, we already know this.
So in that case, one of the things that I talked about a little bit earlier is though we already
Apply those
question.
Same thing.
And so you
Yeah.
can apply that not just to students who are pushing back against the existence of racism, but to say, hey, we're looking at specific articles today. So like we're looking at the EJI reports, we want to look at those. Or like, I know you already know about it generally, but what's
Yeah.
going on in your major that's going to be
Yeah.
relevant to this?
Oh, that's great. Thank you. You really answered my question. I appreciate it a lot.
Thank you. Happy to help.
Oh, can I say something? Sorry, Nick.
Go for it.
I think, I can't speak for I'm not a white educator. One of the things that was beneficial for me when my mentor many years ago, when I was to my master's, so I want to echo real quick, just being open and honest about where your social, cultural, racial location is very important. When I'm dealing with my students of color, especially when I'm dealing with Black students, to be specific, I make sure that I am specific when I'm using terms. When I'm with, of course, you have to know your crowd, if this makes any sense. But when I'm with people of color, I just sit down, create a circle, and we have a discussion. But I'm very specific. I with them, I don't use multicultural. I don't use diversity. I say exactly what I mean. And they tend to respect that. This is what I mean. I'm very knowledgeable. I'm not going to skirt around the issue. I'm going to be very direct with you. And that authenticity does well in building rapport for me, at least. And it built rapport when people that were teaching, professors that were teaching me were white. They're predominantly, overwhelmingly white, delivered at least that close to that level of authenticity, if that makes any sense. Very specific, very direct.
It absolutely does.
And so diversity, Black students in their diversity. What the heck you mean by diverse? What are you talking about? I'm like, but I also make sure to let them know, and this goes back to Kristen's concern. I'll call it a concern right now. But I let us know, even we might not have problems with race, and from my travels, Black students in the North tend to view race a little differently than Black students in the South. But I say, hey, you may have a firm understanding of race, but we all have some blind spot somewhere. So when we get to gender, when we get to other things, neuronormativity, when we get to sexism and misogyny, when we get to those are areas you might be able to grow. So please help me in teaching others. Yes, that's wonderful. But these are some other areas we can grow. So it turns in, I just let them know that there are some blind spots that we can address later on. But once again, to answer your question, I think answer your concern. I think being very authentic as we can, being very direct in our usage of language is beneficial. I'm sure you've seen that to some degree.
Oh, well, this is exactly what I just needed to like confirmation that I was like, I'm just going to be upfront and honest with them and just say, hey, I'm a white woman in the South. I am mega privileged. And so my experience, this is what it is. And then we're going to, talk it out.
Are there any other questions? Anything else people would like to talk about?
I wanted to make a comment quickly. Lynn just made me aware that one of the links to a chapter in the textbook seems to be coming up. For example, the link to chapter 6 might be coming up to chapter 7. I'm looking into that now. So if you come across that, I'm sorry. Try to maybe go to the table of contents, but we will definitely look into this and get that fixed.
That link works, Amy. It's just misleading because it says chapter 7, but it does take you to 6. So
oh, I got you. I think what happened is we moved chapters around, but instead of going back in and changing the number, we just left the link so we wouldn't have to replace it in everywhere that we had already marked it. So thank you. Any other questions or comments for our discussion today?
I will say for the links that are in the diversity in your major assignment, typically when I'm introducing that in the classroom, we get a chance to open some of those and direct them to specific ones. If the assignment was going to stand entirely on its own, there are some of those that I would suggest giving specific instructions for, such as, for example, for the criminal justice one, identifying like, oh, read the executive summary. You're not expected to read 85 pages for this. For the journalism link on there, I believe that that one goes to a variety of resources, but there's a couple in particular that I'd be putting them towards. There's actually a big toolbox of journalism resources that I found for that. In the long run for this, I would love to get ones that are identified by people within particular colleges as like, oh, this really addresses it well. Since my background is in English, I can talk meaningfully about whether that's a good article in English. Not sure that I can do that for every field. And so I want to make sure that these are high quality sources that would be recognized as that within the field. So that's my goal for that assignment. It's one that I intend to support for some time. So. All right. Well,
This has been wonderful, Neil, by the way. I just want to say that out loud.
oh, thanks. There aren't any other questions. No need to keep everyone, but if you have questions individually about this, please reach out. If any of the resources need improvement, I'm happy to do so. Just let me know.
Thank you so much, Neil. And as a reminder, the session was recorded, and once it's rendered, I will upload it to our YouTube faculty channel. Thank you again, Neil, so much, and everyone for your attendance, your participation, and your experience and input. I hope y'all have a great day.